and with one of our favorite CSIS operatives, Phil Gurski, and he's a prolific writer. And we need to talk about what is actually going on right now. There's so many things going on in the world. And, October 7th actually set the clock back. And if you look at what is, I thought Canada was a tolerant society. Apparently, I was wrong. And so Phil, can you help me out with understanding what is going on right now and the terror cycle? Most people don't understand the terror cycle.
Mhm. Wow. What a great start, Jim. I'm one of your favorite. How many favorite CSIS operatives do you have?
Only one.
Only one. Yeah. What worries me right now, Jim, is that people seem to have forgotten that what we're seeing right now happening in Gaza, and it is horrific. The loss of life is just, it's heartrending. None of this would have been happening right today. The civilian casualties in Gaza City and other parts of the territory, this would not be an event had what happened on October the 7th never happened. Okay, so let's just remind your listeners, on October the 7th, Hamas, which is a listed terrorist entity in Canada and in many of our allies nations, launched a horrific series of attacks in which they killed more than 1,400 Israeli civilians, largely civilians. A few IDF, Israeli Defense Forces soldiers were killed as well, but largely civilians were killed. That was a massive terrorist attack, which was proportionally greater than what the U.S. suffered on 9/11. Okay, when more than 3,000 were killed by Al Qaeda. There's no other way to describe what Hamas did than as a terrorist attack. I've seen people say, well, it was an act of resistance or it was legitimate violence, blah, 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 blah. If you cannot condemn the act of October the 7th as an act of terrorism, then we have nothing to talk about. I don't acknowledge your position even from the get-go. The Israeli response, first of all, Israel has a right to a response to locate and bring to justice or kill the Hamas operatives responsible for that heinous attack against women and children and civilians. Are they doing it the best way possible? Probably not. I'm not a military strategist by any stretch of the imagination, but clearly, Palestinian civilians are losing their lives now in Gaza. But again, two things. First of all, Israel would not be launching airstrikes in Gaza had Hamas not attacked the country in the first place. And secondly, that very same group that launched the terrorist attack is housing themselves, hiding among civilian populations. They set up operations in hospitals, in schools, in playgrounds. And so Israel, which is trying to locate and identify the Hamas terrorists responsible to try to eliminate them, unfortunately, the way that war happens, it's not like you see in Hollywood, Jim. It's not that precise, where a guided missile can take out one person and one person only. It doesn't work that way. Unfortunately, Palestinian civilians are dying, and those civilians are dying because the Hamas terrorists, which occupy and rule the Gaza Strip, want them to die because it makes their cause look good. I can't put it more bluntly than that. I'm not praising the death of civilians. I'm just trying to say is that there would be no civilian casualties in Gaza had Hamas, a terrorist group, not killed Israeli civilians.
Well, my concern is in what I believe even law enforcement officials, okay, like leaders, they don't understand the difference between criminality and terrorism.
Yeah.
They don't understand geopolitics. They totally don't understand. And when I travel as you do, when I go to Europe and other places in the world, it's clear that the law enforcement and military are on a different level. They're on a different level based on their tools and the way they dress. It's clear that they understand Bader Meinhof, Red Brigade. They understand 100% what the outcome can be. And what I'm disturbed with, and you posted it yesterday about how people came from other countries to this country to live a better life, a tolerant life. And now it's the antithesis of that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's a great point. Look, I know emotions run high, and I know we see these pictures of dead bodies in the streets of Gaza, innocent civilians being killed, and you can't help but it can't help but affect you emotionally and intellectually, and hence we see the protests here in Canada and elsewhere for the war to stop. We all agree, Jim, that war is a terrible, terrible thing. We humans, unfortunately, seem wedded to it. I just read an article the other day that estimates that warfare as a human tactic is probably about 10,000 years old. We've been at war pretty well since we moved into towns as a species. And as of today, there are 26 what are called hot conflicts around the world, meaning war. There's 26 wars going on right now. And it's never proved to be a solution to anything, and yet we keep turning back to it. Terrorism is different, though. I mean, terrorism is violence for a cause, be that cause ideological or political or religious or whatever kind of thing. And it's a fairly recent phenomenon. Only really dates from the middle of the 19th century. What worries me is that people don't understand what terrorism is, and all kinds of things get called terrorism, which are not, and some things don't get called terrorism, which are. We can talk about that. It almost seems to me that the term has outlived its usefulness. If we can't agree on what the term means, then how can we have a sane conversation on terrorism as a phenomenon and what to do about it? I've even advocated in public, maybe we just scrap terrorism from the criminal code and just treat it as what it is. If I kill you, I don't care if it's in the name of God or your pet pig. If I kill you in Canada, I'm guilty of, first-degree murder, and I receive an appropriate jail sentence as a consequence. Maybe we need to start worrying about, well, why did I kill you? Who cares why I killed you? I carried on an act of violence, and I need to be held responsible for it. And when I see the protests against what Israel's doing, and again, there are concerns about civilian casualties, with no reference to the fact that Hamas carried out a terrorist attack that started this whole ball rolling yet again. And you and I both know this conflict goes back more than 75 years now. I begin to become discouraged that we made any progress in this regard.
Well, the other thing I would like to touch on is that if you look at the universities and the places of higher learning, there was a news article in Montreal just yesterday that I posted. Clearly, there are operatives in Canada and other places in the world that roll this thing down the road. It's part of the whole cycle that most people do not understand. And so that, with that said, how is it possible that we vet people to come here and then turn everything upside down? Help me out.
So two things. First of all, on the university issue, you and I are old farts, Jim. But when I was a much younger man, I was probably slightly left of center. Okay, I'm now more. I call myself a centrist. I'm not right of center. I'm a centrist in many issues. So it doesn't surprise me that you're seeing the protests on campuses that are not slightly left of center, but very left of center. So Israel's the problem. Hamas is a resistance group. These are heroes, blah, 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 blah. Okay, because that's just what happens when you're in your university days. You're naive. You haven't, you're not like me and you who spent our lives in law enforcement or security. We've seen the underside of humanity, how nasty people can get. You simply haven't lived enough to understand that. Your other question is a much more serious one. And I think probably the person you're referring to is the so-called imam in Montreal called Aldid Sharkawi. For your listeners, interest. I know him very, very well. He was subject to what we call a national security certificate back in the 2000s. And this was a tool the government developed to basically remove people from Canada who were not citizens because they constitute a threat to national security or public safety based on the intelligence that we had collected. And we had, we had evidence, or sorry, let me rephrase that. We had intelligence that suggested that Mr. Sharkawi had links to Al-Qaeda. And lo and behold, he didn't put that on his application form when he came to Canada. Go figure, right? So it's a shitty tool. We've only succeeded in, I think, deporting one person under national security certificates. I mean, my numbers are out of date, but it was one when I was there. Mr. Sharkawi successfully stayed in Canada, became a citizen of Canada, and is now calling for the destruction of Jews in Israel. So there's a couple things there. A, leopards don't change their spots. I've known that for the better part of my life. Secondly, we've got a guy who has abused the system to become a citizen and still spread his hate amongst Canadians. And thirdly, and this is the most important part, Jim, we have a series of governments, and by governments, I mean the machinery of government, that refused to act on the intelligence it was given with respect to people like Mr. Sharkawi, people like Mohammed Harkat, people that we had solid intelligence for members of terrorist groups or held terrorist ideologies, and we let them stay here. And you know what? You know what the worst part about this is, Jim? These people turn around and sue us. They sue the Canadian people for millions of dollars for spreading falsehoods about their reputation. I mean, you can't make this shit up. I mean, how naive are you as a nation that you allow someone like this to come to your country, stay here despite his terrorist affiliations, and then become a citizen and start, basically calling for acts of terrorism against Jews and Israelis around the world? I don't know how you get there.
But here's the thing. Like, we're in the 1930s in Germany. Okay, this is exactly what is happening. They're shooting at schools. Okay, they're shooting at Jewish schools. They're burning down synagogues. They're banning restaurants. You know what? I'm so surprised that Canada, that is like the most tolerant nation in the world, has now showed its face.
Yeah.
And it's embarrassing, and I don't say anymore. This is what it is.
Look, the vast majority of people who come to our shores come here for the right reasons. They come here because of the freedoms, because of the economic opportunities. They're fleeing persecution, blah, blah, blah. My own grandparents emigrated from Eastern Europe during the First World War. And we are a nation of immigrants, and we are proudly so. But the problem is, and this is what you're getting at, there's a handful of people who come here for the wrong reasons. They come here to basically spout their own hatred. We've seen it amongst the Sikh population in Canada with support for an independent Khalistan using violence. We've seen supporters of Islamist extremist groups like Al-Qaeda coming here, and the list goes on and on and on. It's inevitable that if you take in, and what's the government's goals now? Is it 500,000 immigrants a year? Your security services can't vet 500,000 people. I'm sorry, there's just not the resources to do that. But when you get information that tells you these people are not here to become fully fledged Canadians and support our national experiment and what Canada stands for, but to simply promote and continue the causes that they're wedded to from their homelands, you need the mechanisms in place to say you're not welcome here. We're gonna punt you back. And yet the story that was used all the time in the cases that I worked on, oh, you can't send me back to country X because I'll be tortured and killed there. And as a consequence, the government sat on its hands and did nothing. Jim, these cases go back 20 or 25 years. And the intelligence that was collected was simply not used to make the right decision. I don't know, what else do you want your security services to do? Mind you, you've got a government that was told about Chinese election interference, and you have a prime minister who said he didn't read the intelligence. What do you want, sir? Do you want it on a silver platter? Do you want me to beat this into your brain? Like, wait, what more can your security services do than provide you with information upon which you can make better decisions? I don't have an answer to that question.
Well, I would like them to listen at the very least. That is what I would appreciate. but like I say, I travel a lot. Okay. And I know just on the way law enforcement, military, the way they're dressed, the way they're posted, the gear they're carrying, I know they're more on point with counterterrorism or anti terrorism than any law enforcement agency in North America.
Mhm.
We don't get it.
We don't get it for a couple of reasons. So when I was at CSIS, we did our utmost to actually brief law enforcement agencies. I briefed more police forces across Canada than I care to remember. I've got patches from every police force in the country, I think, because I gave them presentations. There's a couple of issues here, Jim. First of all, terrorism is not a law enforcement area of responsibility in Canada, with the exception of the RCMP. So if you're working in Toronto Police, you're not doing counterterrorism. You're doing traffic crime. You're doing murders, rapes, all that kind of stuff. Secondly, there's a classification issue. Unfortunately, rightly or wrongly, information is classified to a degree where it cannot be shared with law enforcement. And we got to figure out a way to fix that. Look, I worked for the OPP, the anti-terrorism section, when I retired from CSIS in 2015. And, we couldn't get the intelligence from CSIS. So they brought me in to kind of, help them understand how do you collect your own information to an evidentiary standard, which is what cops need to actually bring charges and go to court kind of thing. So we have to do better, I think, on that level. A lot of other countries, you mentioned that they get it, and so amongst my favorite partners when I worked at CSIS were the Scandinavians, and there's a very simple reason for that. The Scandinavian equivalents to CSIS in Finland, in Sweden, in Norway, and Denmark were all police security services. What does that mean? It meant that they were first and foremost law enforcement agencies that had counterterrorism responsibilities. So what that meant was that, and I don't know anything about Finnish or Swedish or Danish law, but I'm guessing that what that meant was that the information that those services gathered on their counterterrorism files, which were one amongst many files, was gathered to an evidentiary standard, which means it could be used in a court of law. And that's not what we have here in Canada. CSIS doesn't collect evidence, it collects intelligence. And it hesitates to share the intelligence with people that need to know it so that they can use it in their own investigations. Because if intelligence gets mixed with evidence, that's a bad day. Because defense picks up on that. It says, I want CSIS on the stand. I want CSIS sources on the stand. And CSIS sources are not going to testify. That's one of the advantages of being a CSIS source versus a police agent, is you'll never have your identity disclosed in public in a trial. So there's a lot of things we could do a heck of a lot better. And I think we can learn from our international partners in this regard.
Well, I agree 100%. And so I'll close on this. Okay. So October 7th has been seen as an Israeli intelligence failure. That said, they're the best in the world. However, I believe we are so dependent now on signal intelligence, and nothing beats a human at the gate. Nothing. And I think that's where we've gone to try and pawn off our responsibility as a person. And I believe that there's many things. 2005, they pulled out. There's a whole lot of things there, but I believe that when we become dependent on AI and cameras, I think we're losing the plot 100%.
Yeah. So a couple of things there. You make a very good point, and this was what was made during after 9/11. Is that the Americans depended far too much on signals intelligence than on human intelligence, and they missed the boat. Okay. Look, I worked in SIGINT for 17 and a half years at CSE, Communication Security Establishment, before I joined CSIS. So I understand SIGINT, understood SIGINT. It's obviously changed a lot in the last 20 years, but I've worked both sides of the house. And to me, when you work in intelligence, you want all the tools available, not just SIGINT and human, but I meant imagery intelligence. There's all kinds of things you can get, ELINT, electronic intelligence. You need to have them all. And there's no question, I think, that maybe the Israelis relied a little bit too much on SIGINT because they were collecting all the cell phone conversations coming out of Gaza. We know that Hamas was not using cell phones because they knew they were going to be collected. So they'd be much more careful. So did the Israelis have a lack of human sources? Possibly. But on the failure issue, Jim, and this is really important, look at when something goes wrong, you want to point the blame at somebody, right? And when you work in intelligence or in law enforcement, you know this very well, you're only as good as your last failure. If you're perceived of not getting the bad guy in time and someone dies, it's your fault, no matter what you try to do. I've been reading accounts that actually, in this case, I'm not saying the Israelis got it perfect. They're very good at what they do. As you said, they're amongst the best intelligence in the world because they have to be, because of the nature of the threat that they're faced with. But I read some very credible information recently that, in fact, the Israeli military had intelligence on Hamas, maybe not exactly October the 7th, but they had information on Hamas that they were planning something. And guess what? The Netanyahu government refused to listen to them. In fact, refused to even allow them to brief the cabinet, which suggests to me either Netanyahu had some kind of a game plan in mind, or that for whatever reason he didn't trust his intelligence services. So I would go a little bit easy. And I get it. To me, it's personal. I don't like to hear the phrase intelligence failure. Were things done wrong? Things are always done wrong. And you know that based on your career. But there's a lot more to this picture than what we're being presented with. So I think there was intelligence available. It's never the complete picture. You know that as well as I do. Intelligence is part of a much broader series of considerations. But it appears, based on what I've read, that the intelligence was ignored, which, bringing it back to Canada, what does that sound like? Well, can you spell Chinese interference in our elections, where the Prime Minister says, I didn't know there was any intelligence on this. Well, sir, we gave it to you. Oh, I didn't read it. Well,
my friend, that's our next podcast. And you know what? I agree. Like, the frustration is that people like you and myself, we sit, we tell people what it is and they refuse to listen because they have a different agenda. And
100%.
It's just, unfortunate. Here's what I'm hoping for, that tomorrow when I go to Remembrance Day, when I go to the cenotaph, that people respect what our forefathers laid down, so they could have an opinion, they could, so that, and I'm a bit concerned, right? Because in Britain, they've called for a 1 million man march. It's a big controversy, and you know how this works. And for the last month, we've had protests in every major city, Ottawa, Toronto, Montreal, on Saturdays. And I'm afraid, because the cenotaph, the major cenotaph in Toronto, is right beside Old City Hall, New City Hall. It's right beside it, where it has become a huge problem. And all I'm asking for is respect. Just please be tolerant and respect people.
I couldn't agree with you more, Jim. You know what? You're right. Our forefathers did fight, and in some cases gave their lives for the freedoms we have. You have a right to protest. You have a right to express your opinion. Do it on Sunday. Tomorrow is a day to remember those who fought on behalf of Canada, rightly or wrongly. Because I've been doing a lot of presentations, because I'm part of the Legion here in Russell. This is not about war and the rightness or wrongness of war. This is about people who made a sacrifice. It's as simple as that. And once a year, for half an hour, we take time out of our busy days to bow our heads and say, thank you for your sacrifice. We respect it. This is not a day to protest. This is not a day to use your own agenda or whatever, or to, sell samosas at the side. This is a day for respect. And if you can't do at least that, then what the hell are you doing here in the first place?
Phil, I thank you, and I'm going to close now. And I really appreciate speaking with you, and you being a friend to the Canadian Tactical Officers Association. You say what it is, and I love the truth. And I love people that are brutally honest, and I appreciate you, and I thank you so much.
Thanks, Jimmy. It gets me in trouble sometimes, but I'm just trying to tell things the way they are.
So it does. Right?
Thanks, Jim.
So it's Jimmy Bremner, CTOA, Copcast, Phil, myself. We're out. Hey guys, it's Jimmy Bremner with Copcast, the CTOA, Canadian Tactical Officers Association, brought to you by RBG Security, Hudson Supplies, and Lambert Less Lethal. Today I have a really special guest, my friend Chris Hudson, and he's all the way from the Ukraine. As you can see, he's dug in there So we're going to get an up-to-date, report on what's going on the ground there. But really, today's podcast is about November the 11th, Remembrance Day or Armistice Day, and when you look at what's going on in the world right now, I don't know that I've experienced a more important Remembrance Day coming up this Saturday, and it's like all these brave people went before us to make a more tolerant world, and it's like we've thrown it all away now. So I'll start with that, and we'll talk about all of our experiences and what it means to us. My father was a gunner in the Lancasters over Europe during the war, and had an uncle that was in the occupation forces afterwards. And through my career, I've worked closely with the military units and guys, and it's a really close bond. And November 11th means a lot to us. So with enough from me, I'm just going to talk to Chris now. Chris, how you doing? Thanks for having taking time with us today.
Very much a pleasure, and always good to see you again. It is
So Chris,
certainly a notable Remembrance Day, as there's been such a loss of life. It's tragic.
So how long have you been there? I think you told me you arrived May.
I arrived in Europe halfway through
Yeah.
May, and then approximately, 25th, 26th, I was here in Ukraine. I had a meeting, and I was fast-tracked due to certain experience.
Right. So you're helping out in a humanitarian capacity, and say what you can. Right.
I'm helping with. I'm helping the military. We'll put it that way.
Okay.
As
Sure.
well as a number of other humanitarian causes.
Right. And how much help do they need for people that are not really? People pay more attention to their phone and things like that now than they do to world events. So what's your day to day? What type of help does Ukraine need right now?
Well, the troops are very well trained. They know the equipment. They've been training for a solid decade that way.
Right.
What they do require is more equipment. Quite good. SAMs, surface-to-air missiles, they require more of those. These are very basic things, but when you can go ahead and take a piece of equipment that maybe costs, say a drone,
Right.
it may cost a few $1,000s. However, go ahead and take out $4 million or over $5 million, then, there's others, of course, that may cost, say, $20,000 to $40,000 that can go ahead and take out something that is quite a sum more.
Right. So what about the civilian population? How are they getting through their days? Is there, food, water? Are the kids going to school?
The cities, I'll go ahead and put it this way. Can you imagine the Battle of Britain? And you're looking at good morale. They continue with their day-to-day life.
Right.
Yes, there are tragedies, but they keep going.
Right.
The men on the front lines, on the zero line, same thing. Moral
Yeah.
fiber and morale.
Right.
Morale is high.
Well, I think it's important in uncertain times that we keep our morale high and, keep our spirits up so we can, without hope, all is lost, right? So I think it's important that we do that.
Well, thankfully we're winning.
Good. And that's so for people that are on the ground there like yourself, you can see that day to day. You can see us, gaining ground and holding ground.
Very much so.
Oh, that's good news. Um, so let me ask you this as we move towards this Saturday, Remembrance Day. Why should young people care? Why should they be informed?
Return the values that they take, however, hold dear, are under threat by individuals like Putin. And if you go ahead and speak to a number of the individuals in Europe, especially the former Eastern, they are not willing to go back to that type of regime. Ones maybe on over where we're from, of course, North America, they may not understand how fragile and how small our planet is, and how quickly and easily we could be affected. Something I was very pleased to go ahead and hear of was an update on NORAD receiving much needed again, updates.
Right. Yeah. Um, so again, like when I travel in Europe, it's evident in every city that you go in. There's still remnants of, the First World War, the Second World War. Uh, they don't hide history, and they don't take statues and put them into, that warehouse at the end of what's that movie? Indiana Jones, where they, put it in the salt mine at the end. And I think that's something that's missing here. That even if history's bad, those statues are there to say, "Don't go back."
100%. Absolutely. Must go ahead and learn from history.
Yeah.
Otherwise, we are doomed to repeat it.
Well, it would appear we're doing it right now because, quite frankly, I'm shocked about what's going on here in Toronto and North America in regard to what's going on in Israel right now. We're back to the 1930s Germany in terms of people being targeted and firebombed and businesses being boycotted, and it's remarkable to me, especially Canada, where one would like to believe we're a very tolerant group of people based on current events. Apparently, not so much, and I find it shocking.
I happen to agree. And also, I'm not going to go into the political side of it, but what I will say is certain individuals that have been assisting perpetrate things like that, they have been funded with billions of dollars
Mhm.
to rebuild schools and hospitals. Instead, they went ahead and got arms, built tunnels, If they just laid down their arms,
Right.
hey, got peace.
Yeah, it's unfortunately, I think it comes from an ill-informed, population here in North America, and as I said, they're too concerned with TikTok and all these other things that they I don't know any young people that read books anymore or go to a museum, that type of thing. I'm sure there are some good young people out there, but as I said, the last 3 weeks here in Canada, we've really seen a change in the disposition of people.
It's very true. A lot of people don't read books. I was the same protesters that you were speaking of. I don't remember if it was a picture from Sweden, Germany, or Canada. I don't quite recall, but it was one of the protesters. And it was interesting to see he was carrying a sign of a swastika. And I don't know if a lot of people realize that used to be a Buddhist symbol and still is.
Yes. Actually, you see them in India quite often on the sides of building. It's not tilted on the angle, but it's typically
Precisely.
seen in buildings in India. Yeah.
So I was going. My family fought against the Germans both wars,
Right.
rightfully so. And I was just thinking of the irony that had they won World War II, that individual would not be, he may not even exist.
Right.
And we have the freedoms, and unfortunately, because of a lack of knowledge, and sometimes it's willful ignorance as well,
Agreed.
The freedoms are misused. A lot of people can go ahead and write a poem with a pen. Others will go ahead and, you can use it actually as a medical tool.
Mm-hmm.
And then you go ahead and look at, say, Putin, who signs millions of people to war.
Yeah, it's again, it's a funny thing. As I said, in North America, and I'll reference Canada once again. As I said, when I travel in Europe, it's clear that they haven't gotten over World War II. I mean, they haven't, as I said, because there's still remnants of buildings and prison camps and that type of thing. And another interesting observation I made last week is when we're seeing the protests in support of Hamas, the German police are not having it. They're they get moved on, they get arrested. It truly is zero tolerance based on that history in that country.
I'll actually go ahead and say very simply, in Europe, it's a bit different. For instance, with the gentleman that I serve with people from all nations. We speak multiple languages. There's people of different faiths, and skin tone or whatever you want to call it. Doesn't matter to me. I have family that looks like the United Nations personally, but anyway,
Sure.
other people look at that nonsense. I prefer looking at someone's heart and mind.
Right.
Anyway, so we all get along, and these individuals have all lived in Europe for many years. And one of the things that they like is the history, because then they can learn from it. When you go ahead and look at, say, Afghanistan, where they go ahead and blow up a Buddha, the oldest in the world, or they go ahead and get rid of an Alexandria. Of course, I'm not speaking of the Ptolemy empires,
Right.
but of course, the library.
Yeah, interesting. like I said, if nobody's been to Europe, it's worth going just one time, because everywhere you step, you're stepping on history, and you're learning the whole time that you're there.
Are there any questions that you might have at all?
Well, again, I'm just hoping that you're safe and sound there, and you're looking after yourself every day, as I know you do. Um, at some point, I'm hoping you come home so we can go out for a coffee or something like that. Uh, but yeah, I mean, I understand the situation that you're in. Um, but I guess what I would say is, remember, there's always people back here thinking of what you're doing over there.
Well, making sure everyone's safe over here.
It's a big responsibility.
Actually, this November, I've been doing it for 26 years. So
Wow.
my last job in Canada was looking after Ontario and Quebec. So millions and millions of people. So,
Right.
Yeah. I really appreciate I love Canada. I've always given her my all.
Well, there's no question about that, right? So, like I say, keep in touch. You know where to get a hold of me. If there's any way I can help you, you let me know. All right, my friend?
Sir, yes, sir.
Okay. Godspeed. Bye-bye.